Hey, good morning, Ecclesia. It's so good to see you. I'm here with my dear friend, Drew Jackson, who is the pastor of Hope East Village in New York City. And so he has been so gracious enough to join us and to open the scriptures with us during our digital gathering this upcoming Sunday. But, normally when we have a guest speaker, we're able to interact with them. We can take them out to lunch after, kind of get to know a little bit of what makes them tick. In this scenario, obviously, it's sort of like bringing in somebody that you have no idea who they are. And so I wanted to just host a conversation. Drew is one of those people. The first time I met him, just has a presence and a gravity to him. And just as I've been able to get to know him more, I've just seen more and more the deep spiritual well, the deep well of integrity, and just really beauty that this man draws from. So I'm so excited to just introduce you to Drew, to let you hear from him this week. But I wanted to give you some context around that. So that's really what this conversation is about. So Drew, thanks for being here with us. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me. This is different, man. This is weird, but glad we can still do this.
Now, Drew, tell us about the good stuff. Tell us about your family life, a little bit about your church. What's been going on? How long have you guys been in New York City? Can you give us a little insight into that?
So I am married. My beautiful wife, Janae, we've been married for about 8 years. And, we have 2 5-year-old twin daughters, and we're navigating the virtual school thing right now, which is, it's a handful, but it's all good. We've been in New York for, let's see, we moved. So I was pastoring a church. I was pastoring at a church in Pennsylvania prior to us coming to New York City. And I started actually commuting up from PA twice a week in June of 2017. So coming up twice a week, starting to do the early church planning work, gathering, building core team, all that stuff. We moved our family in January of 2018. And then we launched Hope East Village in March of 2018. So yeah, we've been going since then.
That's really amazing. The homeschool thing is like no joke, right?
No joke.
How would you rate yourself as a professor of many subjects at home? How are we doing there?
The subject. So I mean, we have kindergartners, so the subject matter is fine. It's just all the other stuff of, how do you help 5-year-olds stay focused on a Zoom call, right? How do you help them just remain engaged when like they don't feel like it? So those are the hard things.
I'm still trying to figure out how to help a 35-year-old stay focused on a Zoom call. So I'm feeling that.
I feel that.
So you've been in the East Village. Tell us about the East Village. I mean, obviously it's such a bastion of culture, throughout the course of the last several decades. And just, so give us some insight into what pastoring in that space is like, and just, maybe how crazy it really is.
Yeah, no, East Village is a beautiful place, man. It is a beautiful neighborhood where so many different ways of life and so many different cultures come together and exist in sort of, a few square blocks. And there's just such a rich history of art, music, and I mean, even justice movements and resistance in that neighborhood. And so I love being there. One of the things, though, that we've discovered about the neighborhood is that, like, even though there's so many different people that cross paths in the East Village, like, there's still, you have like these segmented parts of the neighborhood that don't really interact with each other. So the best way to conceive of, to get a picture in your mind of what it is that, right, on one side of the neighborhood, you've got Facebook's offices. And then on the other end of the neighborhood, you've got the projects. And so that's sort of like everything from Facebook to the projects and everything in between there. That's like the East Village. And, so trying to figure out what it looks like to be in that neighborhood, to pastor, to church plant, to be the church in that neighborhood, is to ask, what does it look like to be the people of God at the intersections of all these things? And what does it look like in a neighborhood where those literally on the margin, so the projects are all the way by the river, like they line the river. And so what does it look like to work to center the voices of those who are literally on the margins of the neighborhood, and to, to fight with them and for them, so that their voices don't get lost. I mean, when I first got to the neighborhood, one of the things that I did was, you do the church planter thing, you spend time, you walk around, you talk to neighbors. And I remember walking down by the projects, and I sat and I was, had a conversation with these two older Black women who just were sitting out there, and we talked for about 2 hours, and they were telling me all about the neighborhood. And but one of the things that they said was, we're looking out at the projects, and they said, we call this the last frontier because they're just pushing us out. They're just pushing us out, and this is all we got left. And so that's some of the stuff that you face in the neighborhood, some of the reality. But yeah, it's I could keep going, but there's a lot of rich stuff and rich history, and even a rich history of faith in that neighborhood, where you've got, we're just a few blocks away from the Catholic Worker, where Dorothy Day started her movement in the neighborhood in the Lower East Side. So like, that's kind of the tradition that we're stepping into as well.
Yeah. And man, I just love, there's a love for the neighborhood that's just emanating out of what you're saying, and appreciation for it. What's it like in that? So you're in sort of this paradoxical place, this frontier between these people who really feel like the margins just keep moving closer to where they are, and then they're being pushed out. And then you have this sort of triumphalistic, and again, I know we begrudge people for this, but they have these opportunities, so they're moving into this space. You're at the intersection of this really converging narrative. What's it like to pastor in a place like that? Because on the one hand, there's so much that's being lost, and on the other hand, there's people who feel like, wow, look, the world is at our fingertips. And how do you help, kind of merge, or how do you help, tell a different story in that space?
I mean, we're still early on in the process. I mean, we're only, just celebrated 2 years, right? So it requires a lot of listening. And that's sort of the posture that we've taken from early on, of saying, like, how it's easy for church planters to ride the wave of triumphalism in a neighborhood, in a gentrifying neighborhood.
Right.
And so what does it look like to not just ride that wave, and to just, and to be a part of pushing out the people who have been there, right? How are we not a part of that? I think that, like, the reality of our church is that we have a mix, but we do have a majority of people who have, like, moved to the city, right? Who have, this isn't the place that they've called home forever, right? And one of the things, though, that we've been trying to do, though, is just to have a regular part of our conversation as a church be just a recognition. And I guess we would consider this even part of formation and discipleship, is to say, like, if we're going to be a church in a place, then we have to recognize that, like, there are those who have been here before us, right? So to part of honoring God by honoring our neighbor, right, is to actually listen to their story, to have to not come in with our own story and our own agenda of things, but to recognize that God's already been present here, that Jesus has already been moving and working in this neighborhood. How can we come alongside of the kingdom work that's already happening, not trying to reinvent the wheel? And just trying to learn humility in this thing. I think that's
Love the way you
really,
said that too.
yeah, I think that's key,
Learning
is just trying to
humility.
learn that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost like a skill. I really love that. And it's just again so much of a sense for your church and your community. I want to center in on you for just a moment and just a little bit about your trajectory towards being a church planner and a pastor. How did God sort of use the talk a little bit about your life leading up to it, sort of an understanding of, yeah, this is, I think, my vocation. This is what I'm going to pursue with my life. What are some of the key events that led up to that?
Yeah. So I grew up in church. Um, I'm the youngest of four boys, and we were in church forever. But and I grew up. By the way, I grew up in South Jersey. I grew up in Jersey, so
Yes,
you know,
and an Eagles fan.
much love for
Yes,
Jersey.
yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I like the Eagles, but my first love is the Packers. So you know,
Okay. Most recent champions among those two.
I am a huge Sixers fan, though. So
That yes.
Ian knows that. But
May
yeah,
they come back in our day, Lord. Do it again.
yeah, we're
Right?
still trusting the process.
Yes, we
But
are.
but yeah, so I grew up in church, but I remember being 11 years old, and our church was like having a conference, preachers conference, whatever, and I don't know, man. Like during that, I remember going home and I was like laying on my bed, and it was the first time that I ever really recognized or felt like God was speaking to me. And it was very clear, and it was very like, I don't know, but just got this deep sense from the Lord that like, I'm going to preach. And and it wasn't something that I told anybody. I just kind of held on to that for a little while and put it in the back of my mind, but I couldn't shake it. And but when I went to college, that wasn't my plan. So I went to University of Chicago to study political science, with a focus in international relations, and I was planning on going to law school because I wanted to. I was like, maybe I'll do some like foreign policy work or something like that. And but as I was both in my studies, right, I'm studying things like, you know, we're reading books like The Strategic Logic of Suicide Terrorism, and we're reading about why wars are breaking out between nations and different global humanitarian crises and things like that. And so I'm reading all of this stuff, and I'm just like, man, what does Jesus, what does the gospel have to say to any of this, right? And then I'm living in Southside Chicago and just wrestling with the realities of the city, of like the racial and the economic and educational disparities and inequities in the city, and asking myself that same question: Jesus, what do you have to say to any of this? Right? Because the gospel that I had been given growing up didn't speak to that. It didn't have anything to say. It was primarily about me and my personal relationship with Jesus, right? But it didn't have anything to say to any of the broader, stuff that affects the world and actually has an impact on my life. But I didn't have a theology for it, right? It wasn't big enough. So I started to just go on my own journey of asking Jesus, what do you have to say? What does it mean to be peacemakers in the midst of a violent world? Like all these questions that I'm wrestling with, and just coming to discover, oh, Jesus actually has a lot to say about this. That this gospel of the kingdom of God is big enough for these questions and for these realities. And so that actually for me was like this moment where I fell in love with Jesus and the gospel all over again, like in a fresh way. And I had a moment where, when Jesus calls the first disciples and he calls them to drop their nets and come off the boat and come follow him. I felt like I had one of those moments where Jesus redefines my vocation, right? Where I wanted to go and do this foreign policy thing. And I'm like, maybe I'll do this ambassador thing or whatever that looks like. And then Jesus was like, no, you can still do the work of an ambassador, but let me change that for you a little bit. You can't be about doing any in any regard be about pushing an American agenda. Let me teach you about the kingdom of God, right? And so there was just this flip for me. Yeah, I ended up pivoting from this, like, heading toward law school, and that's when I decided to head to seminary and just do pastoral work, and got connected to a church in Chicago, became a pastoral resident there for a little while, and and then we moved out to LA, and I started seminary at Fuller. And at the same time also was doing campus ministry work with InterVarsity. So that was like, you know, part of the journey in that direction. And then we came back east because we found out we were having twins and had no family on the West Coast. So that's when we moved back and moved to PA, which is where my wife's family is at. And and then I told you about pastoring here in Pennsylvania and then New York. So it's a little bit of the journey there. Like,
so I love hearing you're talking about almost like a second conversion. Pete Scazzaro talks about this.
Definitely.
And it's a part of the Christian life, is these moments that shake our paradigms, but actually invite us. Like it turns out that the deep things of God are calling out to the deep things in us. And it's like this thing that you were longing for, it turns out that Jesus has fulfillment in his hands all along, but going through the actual trial and the route to get there is often where so many people stop short. And so I love that you're just kind of a witness on that journey. Who were some of the authors or the key figures that you're looking at and you're saying, okay, this new and bigger and wider theology is actually plausible because I hear what these people are saying and it's resonating. So who were some of those people?
Yeah, that you mean that really sort of expanded
that we're pilgrims on that journey alongside you of expanding and just deepening your faith.
Yeah, man. So the first author I read that was really expanding things for me and just giving me a new framework to work with was N.T. Wright, right? N.T. Wright was huge in that regard. But people like helping me to engage conversations around the gospel and how the gospel speaks to issues of race, stuff like that, where people like James Cone and Willie Jennings and J. Cameron Carter, people like Ebony Marshall Turman, and this not specifically to race, but expanding my vision and even giving me a heart for the pastoral vocation with someone like Eugene Peterson, right? Some of these voices were important for me in the journey, and I could name more, but those are a few.
Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast in and of itself.
Yeah, right.
So, yeah. Eugene
if
Peterson
wrote go look him up.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. I mean, Eugene Peterson literally wrote a book that was, you should read these people, and that's the whole content of the book. Like, so yeah, that's definitely something. Now, I think that is. I think it's just those signposts on the journey, and I think when people hear, it's like music. When you hear something new and fresh, if you were to go and ask the person who made that, who's influencing you, it would be kind of, you'd be like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. But they express it in a fresh way, and I think that's so powerful. So one of the things I really loved about you, and just kind of speaking of this music and art kind of understanding, is you're an artist yourself, and we'll get to that in just a little while, because you have been poeting your way through the quarantine in a way that's blessed so many of us. But the way that you have incorporated the arts into the life of your church, into your community, And so I know we've talked a little bit offline about this, but how did that come about as something that you saw as integral? And then what are some of the things that you've been doing to engage artists, which is so much a part
Yeah.
of your community there in the East Village?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a large part of that was letting the neighborhood shape who we
Mm,
become as a church rather than imposing our own way on the neighborhood. And so when you but also seeing that like there's a synergy between um the things that God has put in me and in the others who are part of our team and what God was already doing in the neighborhood. So right, those things are coming together. So like if you know anything about the East Village, you know that like it's known for being a place where artists would come and just create, right? Um, you know, from people like Bob Dylan, right, spending time in the neighborhood to um, the whole the whole punk rock scene being in the
mm,
East Village and just young artists up and coming, even not far, having the beginnings of Def Jam Records not far, right? Like
mm,
there's just a whole lot, and like jazz and poetry, and there's just so much in that neighborhood, and so um, one of our values is we as a church we have a stated value of living beautifully. That's just a value that we have, and what we when we say that we mean that we we want to part of how we want to live as a community is to creatively um, generate beauty in the neighborhood, just for beauty's sake, not for the sake of utility, but just for the sake because God delights in beauty, because God
mm.
is a creator, and so as part, what does it mean to reflect that aspect of God as we exist in the neighborhood? And so, you know, we've done a couple some different things, from big big stuff. So like we one of the and to go back to the comment I made before about this posture of listening, one of the things that came through this process of listening early on was a relationship that was formed with um, an arts center that's been in the neighborhood for a long
Mm,
time, and they have several theaters in that center, and it's been a space for artists to take up residence in. So there's like apartments up there where artists live and do their work, and there are studios and all that sort of stuff. But we were able to end up building a relationship through a series of other relationships. We were able to build a relationship with a guy who runs one of the theaters, and he it was so interesting when we started talking to him, because as we're sitting in his office, he says to us, and these are his words. He says, I'm a I'm a lapsed Catholic, and I've been a part of the progressive art scene in New York since the 70s. And he
mm,
said one of the greatest tragedies that we of the arts community have done is to sever ourselves from the faith community. Like he told us this, and then he said, um, we need to be in conversation with each other. And so
mm.
that just kind of started this whole conversation where, yeah, we just started like talk about partnering together. And but one of the things that we've done, and we've done it a couple times at this point, is we've hosted there a Christmas jazz concert.
It's
Um,
amazing. It was on Instagram,
um,
Drew. It's so good.
It's so, I mean, it's so much fun to put together, but it's called Behold. And we've had just artists from our church bring together their gifts to bring to that space, and just putting a whole night together of just beautiful music, beautiful art, and having it be something. And we said to them, like, we don't want to charge for it. We just want this to be something that is a gift to the neighborhood.
Mm,
And what we did was we just let a lot of people in the neighborhood know, from school teachers and principals to crossing guards to like, just come out and just enjoy and just be a
mm,
part of this. And like, yeah, it's been something that to this point it's like, oh, that's just one of the things that we do, right? um And so that was, that was one thing. And another thing that we've done is just, and this wasn't even, and it's still not technically like a church event that we do, but it's just something that a few of us
It's the
started
best thing.
doing, as we
Yeah.
started doing this thing called the listening room.
Mm.
And the listening room is a space where basically we get together in someone's living room around a vinyl record player, and we have people bring an album for the night. And basically it's sort of like they're offering their gift to the space, and they're bringing part of who they are to the space. And the whole idea is, let's just listen to this album in community, side A and side B, and ask one question: what did you hear? And it's a conversation that's not about critiquing the music along the lines of like whether I like it or don't like it. It's just, what are you hearing? What is this artist communicating? Right? Like, and it just has just become a space where like all sorts of people who are followers of Jesus, people who are part of other faith traditions, people who don't profess faith at all, but we're sitting in that space and we're having these conversations around art that lead to conversations around all types of things. And yeah, I mean, and we've just been doing that like once a month, and it's just been a cool space. So those are a couple of things that we've done.
I love it. It's like an LP Lectio Divina, just like what is the Spirit doing through this? Now, you describe this kind of this expression of the arts, and before you described kind of this expansion of your own theology, and this kind of like understanding that God just he puts trees in the garden that are just nice to look at. Well, why did he do that? Because that's the kind of God he is. Like, it's almost that sort of thing. How has that been sort of a part of that expansion, moving from this kind of gospel of me and my Bible and Jesus and my soul, hopefully I'll fly away one day, to this understanding of embracing kind of a wider grasp of the kingdom of God? How is that transpired for you, and just kind of an understanding of what it means to live beautifully? I love that value for your community. That's really, really cool.
Oh yeah. I think one of the things that's happened for me in that regard, and just kind of, is even just a reshaping of how I understand who I am, like as a human being. And that like I don't exist. God didn't create me just for the sake of doing things. Right. But there's something about just that is not connected to utility, but is just about being, and is just about the beauty of being human. that brings delight to God, right? And so I think that like even that, it's like it changes how I think about the kingdom of God and what that is, and that it's like, I think growing up for me, I had this aspect of like this perception of being a part of the church, that it was all about like, okay, this is what we're doing in the world, and this is, but like never ever stop to just think of like the God who sings over us with loud singing just because of pure delight, right? That is separate from what we might do, but that just simply because. And I think that that changes a lot about how we view ourselves, and even how we view others, and being able to see and recognize others as image bearers, and that alone is beautiful. That alone is gives them dignity and worth and value, right? Apart from anything that they do or don't do. And so, yeah. I don't even know if that answered your question.
Oh, it does. And it's so, I think you said it changes the way we view others, but it's sort of along that greatest commandment line. It changes the way we view Jesus.
Absolutely.
Like, what if Jesus actually likes you? And again, like, people get all concerned about this becoming this, emotionalist, kind of sort of like that we're just moving into an impressionist period all over again, that we're going to romanticize the gospel. It's like, no, what if Jesus sat down to meals because it was inherent to what it means to live in the kingdom of God? And what if he actually ate good food at those tables and liked the people that he was sitting with? I think it changes
Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
And it's this sense of the things that God has put in the world for us to enjoy. Like God didn't just do that, and as sort of a stumbling block and say like, oh, don't like that too much, because one day you're going to go to heaven. It's this sense
Mm-hmm.
of how do we see God drawing near to us in the midst of all this, and yes, how do we cultivate a heart that dies to ourselves, but
Yeah,
within that, so much of dying to ourselves is getting our focus off of ourselves, right? And so I think that that's so beautiful as you begin to see the image of God in others, and then really ask the next order question of whose image is it? Is
yeah,
it an austere, grumpy Jesus, or is it a
yeah.
joyful, brilliant Jesus who is telling these incredible stories? I think that's such a powerful framing.
And and then it's like, what does it mean then to, if being created in the image of God, if that is just beauty, right?
Mhm.
What does it then mean to both cultivate and to protect
Mm.
the beauty that God has written into creation, the beauty
Mhm.
that God has written into human beings? What does it look like to be people who are saying, you know what, when the image of God is marred in another human being, right?
Mm.
Like there is something that should move me to want to stand against that, right?
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
And that is part of the work of living beautifully in the world, is to tend to the beauty, right, in all
Mhm.
things. Like, what does that
Mhm.
look like? And both in human beings, in creation, and that when it comes to the earth and how we relate to God's world, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a part of this whole thing.
I love what you just did there. So what you just did was you just seamlessly weaved these two things together. Genesis 2, there are trees that are good for food. So we have this
Mhm,
sense of justice, of provision, that there is enough for everyone. You have trees that are
mhm.
just pleasing to look at, but there is an inseparable nature to beauty and to justice. This is,
Yes.
you're talking about the intersection. Is they cannot be pulled apart. And so, as you start to think about, what are some of the ways you see in our kind of wider American church, our unique and sort of obviously slightly narrow lens? What are some of the ways you feel that those things are being placed into tension? Or what are some of the ways that you think like
Mm,
the church is not standing on behalf of those whose image is being marred? We aren't living beautifully, and that I love that you framed it in that way. It's not that justice is one arm of the gospel, beauty is one. It's that you cannot have one without the other.
mm.
And Jesus is an integrity of these things. This is what humans do, right? We separate things, we break them down in their parts and think that we've explained them. But what about putting them together again? I think that's so powerful. So what are some things you see from your vantage point in New York City, as a man with young girls, as a man, as a black man in America? What are some of the areas that you see like there's still a dissonance here between this justice and this beauty?
Yeah. Um, where do I start? It's there's so
You
much.
tell the truth. That's what. Yeah,
There's so
yeah.
much. Um, I think, and I think this bleeds into so many of the different areas that we could talk about. But like,
Mhm.
the I think where there's this deep rooting in this inability to see the humanity in each other, and the the ways that we end up objectifying, commodifying people, right?
Mhm.
Um, and uh, we talk about utility, right? Beauty and versus utility, and how people are things that are meant to be used and used up, right?
Mm.
Uh, um, and that is part of the fabric of the society in which we live. And if for some reason you are not useful, right? Then you are discarded. I think we see that a lot when it comes to just conversations around the elderly and how they're
Mm-hmm.
being treated, even in the midst of conversations with the pandemic. Like
Yeah.
see you see that you see um, people saying that other people are disposable, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, and it has everything to do with this thing about utility,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and not being able to see beauty, not being able to see image, right?
Yeah.
I think that you know, even when we talk about the conversations around race in America, uh,
Mm-hmm.
eh, I mean, there's so much layered there, even around the commodification of bodies, right? That's way goes back to our foundations as a country, right? That people are no longer people; they are cattle, right? They are people are no longer people that, and so and even just kind of, but yeah, we could trace through history how that has developed. Um, Over time, and how that has changed form over time, where you have just the movement from uh, chattel slavery, right, into the different forms of dehumanization, right, of keeping people locked out from the things that allow humanity to flourish and thrive, right? And so um, I just I think about that, and I think about the ways that that has just been so deeply embedded into American life, where we can't even see it. It's almost like there's an we haven't dealt with it, and part of the reason why we haven't dealt with it is because it's been intentionally masked so that we can't see it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that we can identify the ways that this is continuing to happen, right? Whether that be in our prison system with mass incarceration, with the ways that black and brown folks are just disproportionately caged, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you don't throw humans in cages, right? That's not that like that is not humane. And
Mm-hmm.
so but that's also part of this, like, how are we viewing human beings? Are we seeing beauty? Are we seeing image? And even the utility question too, because it's like,
Mm-hmm.
what happens when you put masses of people in our prison system? Well, according to the 13th Amendment, they can still be used for slave labor. It is
Mm-hmm.
legal, like
Right.
it is allowed, right? And so when you think about that, and you think about how our prison system developed from our system of slavery, like, you can actually read about how it developed from that point,
Yeah.
and how intentional all of this has been.
Mm-hmm.
Then you ask yourself the question, why is it that 1 in 3 black men are behind bars? Why is that? Why is that a reality in the country that we live in? Is that
Mm-hmm.
just because black people are worse people? Black people are all criminal? Or is there something that is inherently embedded into the system that that is, it's set up, it's doing what it was designed to do, right? The system is working, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's doing what it was designed to do. And so it's just like, we got to think deeply about these things. And it, like you said, it has everything to do with beauty. It's justice
Yeah.
and beauty are so tied together. um I don't know, like, I feel like there's so much we could say about this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I don't know how much space we have. But
So one of the things, and this is it's far too predictable, and I'm almost sorry to have to ask you this question, but basically something happens. Ahmaud Arbery happens.
mhm,
Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery is hunted and lynched. Breonna Taylor is killed in her home, and yes, on some level it could be a horrible accident if it weren't such a part of a pattern that seems to exhibit itself. But the other part of that pattern is you have this sort of virtue signaling online. People that are like, oh, we're going to say their name and that kind of stuff. Which I think there's some power to that. Like I think it's important, and then it sort of dies down. But then you have this other reaction where and I don't want to I don't want to propose ill motivations on the part of the people I want to give voice to, but they basically say, well, I didn't buy slaves. I didn't, I haven't had anything given to me in my life. These are typically white people. What does all this have to do with me? Why are people seemingly talking about white privilege? Why are they talking about these kinds of things as if I had something to do with it? And the piece that I find so grievous is just the refusal, as we've sort of been talking about, even like church planting. Like the first posture is listening; it's not telling. And the piece I find so grievous is this sort of like this kind of secondary wounding that we do, where we have a whole segment, of our Black brothers and sisters in these specific scenarios that are saying, "Are you seeing our pain? Are you seeing this?" And then people are coming along, like Job's friends, and being like, "Actually, here's the reasons for your pain." And so kind of a long-winded way of asking the question: what would you say to those people? That their immediate response is, well, it's not, this is overblown, or this is just a progressive sort of talking point that has bled its way into the church and is somehow separate from the quote unquote, air quotes, real gospel. I think it's such a pressing question for discipleship in our day. So Drew, I'd love just to hear your perspective. And I know it's a heavy question. So please be honest. As much as you're willing to be honest, because I think that's the real. We need the real.
Yeah. Sometimes, sometimes I get sometimes I get as a Black man, as a person who moves through the world in a Black body, right? I get the sense that many white folks think that Black people love to talk about race because it brings us joy, because it's something that, like, for whatever reason, that this is just what people of color like to talk about. We don't like talking about this. We talk about it because this is survival. Like, this is not another issue, right? For us, this is life. And so I think that, like, the recognition that like say if you come to somebody, you've been deeply hurt, and you come to somebody and you tell your story and they tell you that your story isn't true. Right? Like, what does that do to you? Have you, like, I want you to think about if you've ever been in a situation before where where you're like, I just need I am telling my story, right? And then someone, even if you didn't invite them to tell you whether your story is true or not, they volunteer.
Right.
Oh, that's something's made up or something's overblown, right? It's like, what I hear, and I've heard people with good intentions do this all the time, right? This move of either trying to exonerate themselves from racism, like that they're not a part of the whole thing, that it's something over there, or it was just something in the past. I've heard people do it where they'll make that move to, I'm just sharing something, and then my story is met with, I need white approval. Like it somehow needs to be approved by whiteness to be deemed true. And like, it's frustrating, Ian. It
Yeah.
is. Um, it is is something that, like, honestly, it's a I would say that the reason, and you use the word, but that the reason that this happens is that this is a part of the discipleship and formation
Mhm.
of what it means to be racialized in America. It's
Mhm.
to it's to it's to have an ear that is trained to not take seriously the voices and the stories and the cries of Black people.
Mhm.
Like that is part of racial formation, of formation in what we would call whiteness. And when I use the term whiteness, I'm not talking about whiteness as skin color. I'm talking about whiteness as a way in which you move through the world.
Mhm. The Bible
It's
describes them as powers and principalities, right?
powers and principalities,
Right.
right? It's um yeah, it's, I referred to Willie Jennings earlier, and he talks about
Mhm.
whiteness as um, this power that moves, that where it's all about possession,
Mhm.
ownership over, right? Um, this of this space belongs to me. That could be a physical space or a conversational space or whatever space that is. It's my space, right? And if anybody tries to get into that space, right, they are intruding on something that is inherently mine, right? And so um, that, yeah, and so and when you're formed in that sort of way, and that's something that is like, that is just in the air, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
from the founding of the country, right? From the beginnings, it's like you don't think it's going to affect the way that you're formed, that this nation forms people, when you move into a place that is already inhabited by people who have been here for a long, long time, and to just step onto that land and to say, this place belongs to us.
Mhm.
And then add on to that, because God gave it to us. Then you're
Mhm.
theologizing around it,
Yep.
right? And then you create a theology that you know undergirds
Mhm.
this whole idea of white supremacy, and a racialization of things. And yeah, it's really, and so as a Black person sharing my story, you got to recognize that, like, my story's got to penetrate through all that. Like,
Yeah.
it's gotta penetrate through all of those things to get to ever get to a heart that's soft, right?
Mhm.
And uh and so much of it is not, it's not that people are, there are some folks that do, but not everybody's walking around with intentions of, like, blocking people out. But you got to understand that that is a part of the formation.
Yeah.
And so unless there is a counter formation in a different way, an intentional reformation around how we understand ourselves in the world, how we see and recognize our brothers and sisters of color, our understandings of what it means to be human, and the fact that, like, um, what, that we are not isolated beings. We are not disconnected beings. That, like,
Pandemic
what
has shown
affects
us
one
that, right?
affects all. Like, yeah, and all of that has got to be undone.
Yeah.
That and so much more has to be undone if there's ever going to be a formation in a different direction that is really going to allow us to move forward in any significant ways. Like, and my as a pastor,
Mhm.
right? My first heart is to look at the church and to say, the church has unfortunately been one of those systems that we talk about,
Yeah.
um, that has propped up and propagated racism and white
Mhm.
supremacy
Mhm.
through theology and practice, right? And the work, there's gotta, like, the work to really undo a lot of that and to see that change is like, that's stuff that the Spirit of God's got to do. That's when we talk
Mm-hmm.
about regeneration, rebirth, like, we need to be born again, like, point blank.
Yep. And I think that, Drew, what you're pointing at, and I love the way that you phrase that, because I think it's so important for us to just listen and just to hear. And I think, as you sort of, think about the ways that white supremacy has been woven into the fabric of the church. We talked about this in our church a couple months ago, but when Jonathan Edwards, one of the heroes of the American, sort of revival movement, wrote a sermon on the back of a receipt for a young girl, like bought a human being. And on the other side of that piece of paper, because he, didn't have access to an Office Depot, like writes a sermon down that he's going to preach to the people of God. Like, this is in micro exactly the way that these two things are the same side of one coin. And I think for us, and Drew, what you're saying too, I think it's so important for us. And as I talk to, my sort of white brothers and sisters of the faith, I read a piece by Dante Stewart following the Ahmaud Arbery, and he just said, one of the things he said so plainly, and I just thought it was such a poignant way of putting it, is that white supremacy is not, it's black people's burdens in many ways. They bear the brunt and the grief of it, but it's white people's problem. And until we're willing to name it, and this is where we sort of get back to our conversation, about like, what is the gospel? Well, even if you just believe the gospel is about my sins and confessing Jesus, the only way to receive grace in those places is to bring them into the light in the first place.
Absolutely.
And so there's this strange, almost, it's completely undermining to our faith that we are unwilling to at least listen. And I think, Drew, you've really been a guide on that. And I also, I'm sensitive to the dynamics of just like, okay, you're a black man, Drew, let's talk about race. I think that's, so overblown, but I think for us as a community, if we can continue to be foraging ears that listen and cultivating hearts that are soft, not just immediately get defenses up, that's so important in this moment. But Drew, thank you. Again, I know that gets into some heavy territory, and I just appreciate you just speaking your heart and telling the truth.
Yeah, man. And that's it's stuff that you get on one hand, and like, I'm tired of talking about it. I wish we didn't have to talk about it. But there's also the part of me that's like, but I'm not gonna stop, right? Because this is what, like, for me to love my fellow brothers and sisters of color, right? Like, I realize one of the things I recognize about my own self is that, like, I do a lot of speaking in white spaces, right? And so I like, I'm going to ask myself the question, what does it actually look like for me to use the voice that I have for the sake of my brothers and sisters, right? Like, what does that look like, right? And it's not for the purpose of like, oh, we need, like, I hope this doesn't, whatever. I'm just gonna say, like, I don't need white people to approve of me or to accept me, right? The reason that I say these things is because, and that I believe it's so necessary, is because, one, I believe the gospel, right?
Yes,
I believe that the gospel, like, if I'm not if I'm not speaking on these things, then honestly, I'm asking myself the question, am I really following Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have to think about it in the sense of like, when we say we follow Jesus, that always takes place in some kind of context, in some kind of space, right? And when you reckon with the American context, when you reckon with our history, when you reckon with where we have been and where we are at, I don't know how we can claim to be followers of a savior who said of himself, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to bring recovery of sight to the blind, to bring freedom to the captives, to liberate the oppressed, right? How can we follow that savior and have nothing to say to racial violence?
Mm-hmm.
Those two things don't jive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's like, if I'm going to follow Jesus, this is part of the direction I got to go, right?
Yeah.
This is part of the way I have to walk. And, so one, yeah, like I say it because I believe the gospel. And two, I do it because like, I love y'all. I do. And I really believe that, when we talk about salvation, right? When we talk about the saving work of Jesus, I believe that white people need to be saved from whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I believe that there is a salvation that's necessary in that regard, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there is a saving, a liberating, a freedom that God wants to bring, right? To really free folks from moving through the world in that way, so that it actually frees us to love our neighbors well. Like that, I think that's the freedom that's there. And so it's out of a heart of love that I speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so there are those two things that I carry.
I
Right?
think it's so important, Drew. And let me just provide some context for people. If you're sitting there thinking, well, that's not in the Bible. It's not a part of it. Romans 1, the gospel is the power of salvation for the Jew first and then for the Gentile. Paul in Galatians opposes Peter to his face because this is an issue of idolatry. Peter is reverting back to his Jewish comfort and the place where he knows, and he's not eating with Gentile brothers and sisters, because he's not quite sure what the implications of the gospel is. And Paul says of it, he says, I opposed him to his face. Peter and Paul, these two people that have seen the risen Christ, are having a disagreement about what it means to be the people of God. And Drew, you're framing that for us so much. This is about idolatry. And it's about, not about identity. Again, people hear this conversation, they're like, well, am I being told I'm a bad person because I'm a white person? No. What we're describing is an idol of whiteness that has pervaded American culture, and it, again, consistently shows itself in the light. Now with cell phone cameras, even more so, and then gets shoved back into the darkness. And so all we're trying to sort of point to, and Drew, you're articulating this just so poignantly for us, is that we have to be willing to pay attention to these things. And if nothing else, my friends and my brothers and sisters, if nothing else, to listen to people who are crying out in pain and saying, this hurts. And so I think it's so important. I thank you for taking us on that journey. Because again, I know, like, I think you said it well too. I'm tired. Frankly, like, I'm tired of talking about this. And, I think that's such an important thing to remember. It's not something it's like, oh, we get to, this is such a jovial conversation. We get to have this again. I do want to switch gears slightly because I do think, Drew, is so important that, again, people get to hear some of the writing that you've been doing, and so I want to point them to that. But you've been doing some poetic reflections, posting them on Facebook. Are there any other places those things live right now?
No, not right now.
Well, we'll edit that out, and I'll I'll tell people to go to Facebook. So Drew, you've been doing some writing
Instagram, but yeah,
on Instagram and on Facebook. So you can find, if you search Drew Jackson, you can find some of those things there. But just your sense for your pastoral work and poetry, what are the collisions of those two things? Because again, I think so many people think of sermons as prose, and poetry is something that's, again, we've been talking about this kind of utilitarianism, this sense of beauty.
yeah.
How have you kind of come on to this this aspiring vocation as not only pastor and planter and peacemaker, but as poet?
So yeah, honestly, I've always loved, there's always been something in me that had a bend toward the arts, right? And I got that from my mom. Like, she was a writer. Just a lot of, that was just in her. But honestly, I didn't do much writing, like, of poetry, until very recently. I guess with the exception of, there was a point where I was writing a lot of, like, hip hop in college. Yes. I would just write, and by the way, hip hop is poetry.
Yes. And prophetic literature, no less.
Prophetic literature.
That's for another podcast as well.
Yeah. But yeah, honestly, recently, this is something that I've started to pick up in the way that I'm doing it now. And it was more of just sitting in my apartment because I can't go anywhere else. And like, what it became for me was a practice in paying attention, right? Which, if you read any poetry and you're familiar with, like, Mary Oliver, right? She always talks about paying as prayer as paying attention, right? She has a line where she says, "I don't know how to pray, but I know how to pay attention," right? And which I love, and I think poetry, in that sense, for me, if it's a practice of paying attention, then it is a prayerful practice for me, right? Where, especially during this time of quarantine, like, there's so much that can be happening underneath the surface for us that we're not paying attention to. And I think that it's important for all of us to have different practices that would allow us to slow, to pay attention to our emotions, to pay attention to the things that are trying to rise to the surface. Poetry has become that for me. And it's also become, like, Ian, you'll get this because you're a preacher, right? But I write all the time because I'm writing sermons and stuff, right? But there's a difference when I'm writing poetry, because I'm doing writing that doesn't require an explanation, right? I'm not trying to convince somebody of anything or explain or break down things. It's just, I'm just writing. And for me, there is actually a freedom in that, where I can just put words on the paper, and I'm not thinking about, are they going to get this? Are they not going to get this? Are they going to do this? Which I think when you're doing when you're writing a sermon, you're thinking about those things. You're thinking about, so I think in that way, poetry has been something that's freeing for me, where it's just like, you know what? I'm just writing this, and that's what it is. And if you don't get it, that's fine. Then it wasn't for you, and that's fine, right? And I say, in one of the poems I wrote, I just talk about the art of writing poetry. I say, I compare it to, like, I say, like the parables of the Nazarene. It requires no explanation, only contemplation, right? Right, and it's just, it's meant to bring you into a place of contemplation, into the contemplative, and not into the rational explanation of things. And so that's one thing that I also just love about this art of writing poetry.
And you stand in such a tradition of poet preachers, the Jared Manley Hopkins, the Eugene Petersons, the Howard Thurman, like really in this space where, and Eugene Peterson talks about this, like poets and preachers share a reverence for words. And so,
Mm-hmm.
Ecclesia, we say that words create worlds, like that sense
Yes.
of that grasp of the
I wrote
possible.
a poem about that.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that again, sort of to take this conversation full circle, because I think we can do this all day, but just where life and justice and beauty all
Yeah.
merge, Jesus has been standing there all along and
Mm.
saying, "Welcome." And I think, Drew, your life and your witness and the angle with which you refract the big beautiful kingdom of the gospel, is such a witness to that. And so I'm so excited that you're going to be sharing with our community. So excited just for them to get to glimpse a different voice. And I'm sure they grow weary of mine, as all of my mom seemed to do. But Drew, just really grateful for you and for your community, and just want to say thank you so much for joining us. And friends, I hope that this conversation has been just illuminating in a sense of on a myriad of different things, but also mostly illuminating into a little bit of who Drew is, as much as you can get a glimpse of that over a Zoom podcast audio recording. As much as you can grasp that, just sense that there is a profound love that is addressing you as you sit in your living room on a Sunday morning, and that's such a gift to me as the pastor of this church and somebody who loves the people I know Drew is going to be communicating with. To know that person loves them like I do is a gift. So thank you, Drew. Thanks for your time, and
Yeah, man.
thanks so
Thank
much.
you, and I can't wait to actually get down there